Okay, this presentation is a joint event between the Geospatial Centroid, which is CSU's GIS Service Center, and the Warner College class NR 493, which is a GIS seminar class. And so most of us in the list right now, I think, are students in the class. And then we have some outsiders, if you will, who I'm guessing that you just saw the email maybe from the Geospatial Centroid or saw it on the website, and that's how you found out about it. So today's topic will be with Alan Gilbert, and he is a GIS specialist and drone pilot for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working on the National Wildlife Refuges, and he is going to drone on about sUAS, small unmanned aerial systems. So with that, Alan, I will hand it over to you. And first, I want to say thank you so much for your time and presenting for us today. We really appreciate it. So yeah, have at it.
Okay. Let me share that. Okay, are you able to see that presentation?
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me to come chat with you today. My name is Alan Gilbert. I am a GIS professional and UAS pilot instructor with the National Wildlife Refuge System. And I'm just going to kind of talk about how we use it in the Department of Interior and specifically with that refuge system. So before we go too far into it though, what is the National Wildlife Refuge System? So we're a program under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service responsible for the stewardship of 567 trust properties, covering roughly 150 million acres. That's about twice the size of the National Park System. Well, President Theodore Roosevelt established the first refuge, Pelican Island, just off the Florida coast in 1903. And we were initially designed to provide refuge to birds along migratory pathways, but have since expanded to protect all varieties of species. We're in all 50 states and territories, fulfilling that traditional refuge role, but also providing educational and recreational opportunities. You can see kind of in that middle left image that the vast majority of acreage that we're responsible for is up in Alaska. Some refuges that you might hear a lot in the news are ANWR, and then Alaska Maritime are up there. That picture up to our top left there is Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is just outside of Denver. We're also responsible for the Rocky Flats, nestled up in the foothills. And then if you're ever lucky enough to go up to Walden, just south of Walden is Arapahoe National Wildlife Refuge. So some ones that are close to us. So why small, uncrewed aerial systems? Well, so this is a slide from the Department of Interior that we use, where they've kind of broken it out into these four key terms. One, it's capable of supporting the science that we do in our scientifically driven management decisions. Two, it brings a service to our refuges that they wouldn't normally have access to without contract services or something along those lines. So, you know, having aviation on station is a huge benefit to refuges. It does this at reduced cost and increased safety. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that savings and safety piece here as well. This image is from the Department of Interior's first ever UAS annual UAS usage report that was published in 2018. And one of the things that they did is basically looked at all the 543 projects that were flown that year with UAS. And compared that to what it would cost had that project been done by another aviation asset or been done by ground surveys. And you can see, UAS was the lowest among those. And the additional interesting part about, the cost of UAS is it's typically an upfront cost that pays itself off pretty quickly within that first year or so. And what do I mean by that? I mean that upfront cost in what it costs to get you trained to be a pilot, and then that initial aircraft purchase that you're going to get. If you were to start comparing that with traditional crewed aviation, the cost to become a pilot is pretty expensive. And then then you start to add on the cost of the aircraft itself, the fuel to fly it, the cost of maintaining those aircraft. It's just not, it's almost incomparable when you compare it to that upfront cost of UAS. And then the safety aspect. So something I didn't realize, didn't know before I became a pilot for the department was that that aviation is one of the leading causes of death for wildlife biologists in the field. The image that I brought up here is from this past year, 2020's, the department's annual aviation safety report. This past year, the department lost 3 service members during aircraft accidents. And another story that sticks out in my mind from this past year is Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife lost 2 wildlife biologists and a wildlife veterinarian in one helicopter crash when they were studying bighorn sheep in Texas. So I have crashed UAS on missions. I've been able to recover those aircraft, do an inspection of them, and then continue to fly those aircraft for the rest of the mission. So that's not something that crewed aviation often has the luxury of. So, and you can see here, kind of on that third line down, that gray line, that there were UAS losses this past year. We've lost, $30,000 worth of UAS this past year. 2 of those were airframes during prescribed fire burns, where the rotor is actually sheared off from the aircraft. There was no loss of life. One of those aircraft was actually able to fly again after the arm and the rotor were repaired. So vastly, a vast difference between in terms of safety. So how are we structured? How are pilots structured within the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service? So top off, we all start with an FAA Part 107 commercial UAS license. So this is the same license that you all would start with. And all it really is it's $150 to do the testing. And that test or that license is good for 2 years. Within the department, after you've gone through that testing, we are certified. We go through additional certification at the department level, which involves roughly 40 hours of online coursework, and that's general aviation coursework. And then we do a 40-hour resident course. And so for us, that resident course typically covers departmental policies, bureau policies, and then we get a whole lot of hands-on training. And we teach folks how to fly the standard UAS that everybody starts off with. We walk them through a variety of maneuvers to get them comfortable with the controls, and then they're evaluated on their flight performance. And then after that, we basically say that you've got a license to learn at that point, and folks are able to go out and do and perform operations but they're expected to maintain proficiency. So for us, that's flying. We're required to fly 3 times quarterly. And then any additional aircraft that we want to be able to fly, or mission profiles that we want to be able to fly, say we want to fly prescribed fires, we would like to fly at night. Those all have to be, we call that process becoming carded on that aircraft or on that mission set. And so someone else who is proficient and carded on that aircraft or mission has to evaluate us for each one of those. And then we're also expected to just develop generally other skill sets, say in terms of image analysis or rudimentary GIS skills that allows our pilots to better provide better products in the end to the folks that are requesting them. So here are most of the aircraft that we have or have had. Prior to 2016, really what we got when this program started was former military aircraft, whether those are operational or experimental. That Raven in the upper left, if anyone has been in the military or served in the Army in Iraq or Afghanistan, you'd know that that Raven was used extensively in those theaters. And then that middle one, that T-Hawk, from all the accounts I've heard, was a pretty loud aircraft. It's an experimental aircraft. And although it was used in the early years of the Department of Interior using UAS, it wasn't anyone's favorite to go fly around. So, but some of the things that we were limited to in those aircraft were really the sensors that came with them weren't designed for science, and they were, and we couldn't change them, but the aircraft were very, very reliable. And then today, I've kind of lined this out into 3 different tiers of aircraft. Most of the aircraft that we fly today are commercial off the shelf. They're designed for either personal or industrial applications. They're typically low cost, and I'll kind of touch on that. So our top tier up there, what you're seeing, this is your commercial personal use aircraft. This is the sort of stuff you can go to Best Buy and buy that aircraft, buy it off of Amazon, whatever, right? This is about, you know, these are aircraft that are typically under $1,000, but you're not getting what we don't get in that sort of a platform is the ability to change sensors, and the reliability is good, but it's not judged against a standard like what typical aviation assets would be. I'd say the one caveat to that is the aircraft in the upper left is 3DR Solo. That is the workhorse of our aircraft, and the reason it is because we can change sensors on that. That being said, they stopped producing those aircraft 3 years ago or so. And so the Department of Interior bought up as much as they could in terms of both aircraft, blades, batteries, all that sort of stuff. And it's well past its end of life. But we still use it and love it. Mine right now, I have that aircraft and I have a 5-band multispectral sensor on it, which I can't get on any other aircraft for under $1,000. So that middle tier aircraft, you know, with the Firefly and the DJI M600, those are more of the industrial applications. Those kinds of aircraft, you know, they typically require some sort of a vehicle support, whether that's a truck or a UTV, something along those lines. These are in the 10,000 and higher range. And so it's typically $10,000 right around there for just the aircraft. And then, you know, the sky's the limit on the type of sensor that you want to put on there. You know, you could spend $30,000 to $50,000 on a LiDAR to go underneath that M600. And so you're really kind of getting into astronomical prices with some of those, but the reliability is there. And then that bottom one, that pulse vapor, there's the pulse vapor, and then there's also another gas-powered fixed wing asset that those aircraft are typically only used on wildfires or other incidents. They're very, very reliable. They typically require, you know, that you're on station for several days to fly that aircraft, but they can stay up in the air for a long time. But they're very, very pricey, and they're not used very much because that price is so high. So how do we use small uncrewed aircraft within the refuge system? Really, it's kind of in three areas. I'd say that top one is that science and management support. We use it a lot for wildlife surveys, area mapping, different facilities inspections, and then we do a fair amount of prescribed fire monitoring. One of the other assets that we have, that DJI M600 that I just showed you, there's a variant of that that carries incendiary balls in it, and it can actually start prescribed fires as well. And so that's a really popular airframe that we use. And then that middle one, incident response. We use UAS for hurricane, wildfire, search and rescue, and then other law enforcement activities. And you can see in this image to the right, we really fly all over the place in all the refuges. There's some areas of the country where we have less use, but it really is becoming a very popular asset to have on station because of that cost. So you might be interested, you know, where are the data? As the program has developed, we've gotten better about where we're storing our data. Where everyone is trying to move towards is to put their data into Earth Explorer. If you're familiar with that, or if you're not familiar with that, that's typically where you're going to find a lot of your satellite-based imagery from either USGS or NASA. The other place that we store it in the Fish and Wildlife Service is our archive called ServCat. And so you can find a couple of my projects in ServCat. And then I just wanted to put a plug in for NUPO, which is the USGS's National UAS project office. They're located down in Lakewood, and they've been flying, I think, since 2013. They were the ones who did a lot of the early work with the Ravens and the T-Hawks, and they do a lot of our testing within the department. But they've got a lot of great literature, you know, single poster boards, which I'll show one here in a little while, that kind of demonstrate UAS use over time. And they've done a ton of research just to try and find out good or best practices around using UAS. So the last few things I wanted to kind of hit on while I had you were some lessons that we've learned, you know, flying for almost a decade now. And so one of them is specifically within wildlife surveys, is this idea around, you know, are we able to detect the wildlife, and what sorts of issues can we expect in detecting wildlife? When I first became a pilot a few years back, I had to scrounge to try and find literature, any sort of published literature around using UAS for science. Right now, you can go all over and find really great articles, like this one, this graphic from this article, detection errors in wildlife abundance, that was published in 2018, that really kind of show you some things in the theoretical space that you should be thinking about when you're designing your studies. Some potential remedies around these things, are marrying up different sensors. If we were to look at that cow kind of in the lower right there that's hiding in the trees, marrying up a traditional camera with a thermal sensor, might allow you to detect that animal in the wild. Changing your flight characteristics around. So, you might fly these pathways rotating back and forth, and then change it up and fly perpendicular to that to try and get a different vantage point. Or you might fly multiple flights over several days to see if your counts are within a variance. Identification or issues surrounding misidentification are a big concern for a lot of folks these days. Some error sources, pixel density is one that folks think about a lot, and that is improving as sensors improve. Thinking about the flight times to make sure that your lighting is what it needs to be. And then some other things to think about are like image compression. If you have the ability to shoot a raw image, vice using a JPEG image, that JPEG image is going to kind of muddy the waters, or blur your image a little bit to give you a smaller file size. But in doing that, you might not be able to clearly identify what it is that you're wanting to see. And so some other potential remedies around this, again, these multiple sensor ideas using thermal or FLIR with a red, green, blue camera can really help out. Ground truthing is always preferred if you have the ability to do some subsampling and to ground truth. That's always encouraged. And then another thing that folks, you can find some great literature on is people making physical models of birds and other species, and then testing out their flight characteristics to see how those, whether or not the flight pattern that they want to fly and the altitude and all that sort of stuff, whether or not those meet their expectations. Accuracy and precision are always a concern for us, but what we try and instill in folks is the idea around determining what their minimum product that they're asking for is, what's that minimum spatial requirement, and so I'm going to talk about the two different images here. The right one being from that group NUPO that I talked about from USGS, and that requirement, that spatial resolution being very, very strict, because they were trying to do this really a once in a lifetime capture of Devil's Tower. Whereas the one on the left, it was less so, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But some other things that you need to think about, the more images you're taking, the greater your data storage. We have to think a lot about data security. For within the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Wildlife Refuge System, we might be capturing threatened and endangered species. National parks might be capturing something, a culturally sensitive site. And so making sure that that those data are secured appropriately is something that we think about a lot. And the other things to consider as you're planning your projects are your post-processing time and then the platforms. Again, just like literature from a few years back, processing platforms, your different applications to process 4 years ago were pretty much manually intensive. You were either doing photo scan or what's now Metashape, and it required that you have a pretty good knowledge of image processing and the theory behind it. Nowadays, you can throw images into a cloud-based processing service and walk away, and that process will do its own thing and spit out a whole slew of products. So as examples to that, this image to the right, like I mentioned, USGS in 2017 shot this, and they went to extensive effort to try and set ground control to make sure that their resolution on this was as good as it could get, and they processed all these data manually in PhotoScan. The image that I've brought up here is one that I shot. This was shot with a Parrot Anafi, which is a little, a tiny drone that could fit in your pocket practically. This was one 20-minute flight. The image was all captured in JPEG, and it was run through Web Open Drone Map, which is an open source software package that we're using as a cloud-based processing service hosted on our servers. And you can see, it covered a fair area, and the resolution, you can see that resolution really come out in that image up to the upper right. And this cloud-based processing service was able to derive a digital elevation model using photogrammetry at the same time that it produces this ortho image. So, and that was good enough for the refuge staff who needed to make decisions off of it. So, and then lastly, to kind of hit on products, a few more products. This is not an extensive list by any means. Some folks are doing some really exciting, sampling with drones and all that, but some typical products that you're going to produce that people are asking for. On incidents, we get the request a lot for video, to have live video, and then we're also recording that video. People ask a lot for single images or a mosaic image. You might use that for, again, your wildlife survey. And then this image to our right, the top is our natural color ortho image. So that's a mosaic ortho image. The middle is a color infrared. These were all shot with that 5-band multispectral sensor on a 3DR Solo. And then that bottom is an NDVI product, again, from that same sensor. And then as you saw earlier, you can pretty easily derive elevation models from this. One last thing that I've kind of learned over time, trying to put this into practice, is doing land cover classification. Something like an LCD product or something along those lines, and trying to use current reference reflectances that are available through USGS. Those reflectance references are really calibrated around satellite imagery, whether that's Landsat or whatever satellite platform you're choosing to use. And so they may or may not be helpful to you using a UAS out in the field. And so some things that we've had to put into practice are really capturing images at kind of the proper noon, that solar noon, thinking through capturing reference vegetation images at the same time. If we can identify those species right there, go get a couple of pictures with that same multispectral camera, just holding it up. And then if it's at all possible, being able to ground truth some of those target species and associate a GPS coordinate with those is really, really helpful, or can be helpful. So to wrap up, again, this is really aviation for the masses. This technology extends our capability by bringing aviation to the variety of natural resource professions. It's something that I would encourage everyone to go out and get your Part 107. I was a little intimidated when I started that process, but it's a lot easier than it sounds, or than it's presented initially. It's one of those things. I used to say that GIS, an intro level GIS course, it may not be the job that you do, but it's going to make you more appealing to when you're applying for jobs. And I really think that having your Part 107 and having this license to fly UAS is another one of those things that you can have in your toolkit that really makes you appealing when you're applying for jobs. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Alan. Why don't we can stop sharing screen. And are there any questions? Not yet. I added it to the chat, but just so that you all know. So Alan just mentioned getting your Part 107 pilot's license, and the CSU Drone Center, if you didn't know, we have a drone center. They offer classes a few times a year. I don't exactly know when. Has anyone in the Zoom call right now done the class through the drone center? You have?
Hi, it's Pete.
Oh, hi, Pete. How are you?
Yeah, thanks. That was a great presentation, Alan. Thank you. It's good to see you. Yeah, I haven't done it through the Drone Center, but I have done it. And there's many ways to do it. And there's a lot of companies out there that offer 1 day, we'll guarantee you pass the 107. I highly recommend you do the more extensive training and really learn about aviation and weather and so forth, rather than just here's how you get through the test. But I agree, it was daunting at first, and then it was like, this is really cool. So highly recommend. Alan, I was going to ask, you guys, Fish and Wildlife, do a lot of prescribed fire. And I wonder if you comment in a brief sentence your use of drones on prescribed fire before and after, because we're looking at you're flying it during a fire, but then prescribed fire, but then do you guys go back and monitor using drones?
Yeah, so a colleague of mine, well, I'll talk about kind of the before piece of it. So
sorry, that was a long question.
No, we use UAS in really in two aspects for prescribed fire. One of them is to set it. Like I said, that M600 has a payload on it that will drop. I forget the product that it drops, but they're incendiary balls to start fires. And that really, we've had some use of that in New Mexico to start 1,000-acre prescribed fires. So it really gets, allows us to extend our capability out that way. We also, there might be an additional UAS out there that is really doing the monitoring of that prescribed burn at the time. And so that might have a thermal sensor on it married with an RGB camera. That little Anafi that again is pretty much a backpackable size, as a pocket sized. Mine right now it has a low resolution thermal sensor and a 4K RGB camera on there. And so it's really easy to kind of get that thing up in the air with a fire crew and just be their eyes while they're able to watch that. And then a colleague of mine is working on really trying to set some flight characteristics around monitoring and come up with a post burn protocol around prescribed fires. And so it's a little bit of the Wild West right now around that, but there are efforts by us and by other groups to really try and nail down what's a good frequency and again, what the right flight characteristics are for those sorts of things.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's going to be used more and more,
Oh
I
yeah.
think, on active wildfires, not just prescribed. So thank you.
Thanks,
Good
Alan.
work.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Andrea asks, are there additional rules or considerations for private lands adjacent to Fish and Wildlife Service boundaries when flying drones on federal property?
Yeah. So we have a whole host of just flying flying UAS on refuges to begin with. A few years ago, it was pretty common to find videos on YouTube of somebody getting a citation. I remember seeing someone get a citation who was actually trying to fly or who had flown at Rocky Mountain Arsenal. And then he posted a video of himself getting a ticket from a wildlife officer who was able to just follow his geotagged images. And so we have laws or we have regulations around being able to take off and land from federal properties or from refuges. So there's that aspect. We really try not to capture images of private lands unless we've talked to that individual and they've asked us to do that. I have taken, as part of my project, one of my projects in Iowa, we were flying really close to a private, some private property, and we went out, spoke with that landowner, and they asked us if I would be willing to share the images with them, or those products with them, and so that's something that we're allowed to do. And so there's that aspect, it's a little bit of give and take on what's appropriate for us to be able to do. So sometimes we might go out there and just fly on private lands if they're a part of our partners program. If, say, with ecological services, if there is a project that's being done on private lands through ecological services, then we may go out there and actually just fly that lands because it's going to come into some sort of conservation effort. So does that answer that question? Felt a little babbly.
No, that answered it. Great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
We have a two-part question from Mike. First, which is a fun one. What is the most interesting thing you've mapped or recorded with a drone?
So, I don't know. I think perhaps one of the most exciting ones was up at Arapahoe, up near Walden, and I did a significant stretch of the Illinois River that runs through, and that was really my first flight out, and it was particularly exciting for me because on the second day that I was out flying, that's when my drone crashed. And it was, just an oversight on my part that I wasn't really watching the battery. And as soon as that battery went from 40% or hit 40%, the next second it went down to 10% and I was 400 feet up. And so that was a pretty scary experience. But I was able to recover that aircraft and continue to fly. I think some of the more interesting things that are coming about, when I was in Iowa flying a mission, the wildlife biologist on station asked me to fly around and try and get some pictures of the bison that they have on the refuge there. She had not been able to get a census of the bison population. And so, she had spent months that year trying to get a census of that population, which is in an enclosure. And so you would think should be relatively easy to see, but they're also a prairie restoration refuge. And so the grasses out there are, anywhere from 4 to 8 feet tall. And so bison can very easily hide out there. And so I think, using it for wildlife research or wildlife surveys is one of the most interesting things that we are doing, whether that's bird identification or just being able to get census every year. And let's see.
People's grass could be 8 feet high. Other part of that question is it more common to use autopilot with pre-planned flights, or do you fly it manually?
Yeah, so the vast majority of it is flown with autopilot. One of the regulations around with your Part 107 is that you have to maintain visual line of sight. And as you're flying that, you know, the size of some of these aircraft are so small that you get it 400 feet up and, you know, a quarter mile out, it can be very, very difficult to see that aircraft. And so knowing that it's on a pre-planned flight path, and that it's got some safety measures in there, that if it loses signal, it's going to come back to you and those sorts of things, that is, that's just a little bit of assurance for you. So yeah, that's a pretty regular thing. I would say the only time that it's not is if we're shooting things for videography or some sort of, you know, some sort of a communications product as opposed to a scientific product.
A couple more questions. I don't know if you can see the chat, you probably can, but I'll read it anyway. Has there been any collaboration with native tribes to encourage drone use in reservations or native lands?
There probably has. I couldn't speak to it though. I do know that we have Bureau of Indian Affairs does have UAS pilots. And so I'm confident, and I do know some Native Alaska partnerships do encourage that, and do work with the tribes up in Alaska to do a variety of collection for management actions on within their territories.
And then Pete has another question. Are you using fixed wing at all for higher elevations and longer flight time?
We do we have a, the department has, I think, 2 fixed wing aircraft that both require 2 pilots. I think they're in the 50,000 and up, you know, price range. They're both designed for the military, but those are used almost exclusively for wildland fire by USGS. But I don't, the only other incident that comes to mind where they may have used it was the Kilauea response in 2018. But I think they used primarily the DJI M600 to fly most of those missions. And that aircraft itself has about an hour's flight time. A lot of these smaller ones have anywhere from 10 to 25-minute flight time or so, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you can get quite a bit done in a 20-minute flight time. So.
Great. I have a question related to the line of sight. So line of sight is a rule, you have to have line of sight, but are there any allowable exceptions to line of sight to allow like search and rescue efforts or anything? Which
So those things are, yeah, so those things are typically, so organizations have the ability to work with the FAA to get a variance. And we have that. We have a different set of rules that we can fly under as the Department of Interior that allows beyond visual line of sight, that allows night flying, that allows higher altitudes, all those sorts of things. We have to be trained for those sorts of things. So the answer to your question is yes, you can do that. You have to work with the FAA to get that variance. And the FAA typically comes back and says, we need you to do additional training, and you need to prove that you've done that as part of whatever your, you know, whatever your normal instruction is. So for an individual, I don't believe, I have never heard of an individual getting that that ability, but you know, municipalities or law enforcement, firefighting agencies, all that sort of stuff, they typically have some sort of agreement with the FAA that allows them a little bit more leeway on some of that stuff than the average person gets.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I don't think we've ever finished early, but we are like 3 minutes ahead of schedule, which has never happened. This was fascinating. I've learned about drones, but I've never got my pilot's license or anything, and honestly never really learned that much about it. So this was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. I know we have NR 493 mostly, but I know I see there's a couple of NR 322 students in here. Some folks from the library, thanks for joining us. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Alan, so much for your time. We can stick around for a couple minutes if there are any last minute questions. But with that, I will let you go. For those of you in my class, next week we have a lesson, and actually Josh, your classmate, is going to talk about ArcGIS field maps and Survey 123 a little bit next week. All right, thanks.
Thanks very much, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, oh, there's always one more question. There's not a question, but a comment from Drew.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing, Drew. Yeah, getting a drone license is kind of, it's on my list. It's kind of low on my list, but it's something that I would like to get to know how to do. And I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to actually do it. We'll see.
Yeah, I was excited when CSU, when that drone center came up a couple years back.
Yeah.
That was a great idea.
Yeah, and they have that flight school, and it's really affordable.
Yeah.
And it's a good class. Josh, you took it.
Yeah, I took it. But it was during the lockdown, so I only got to do the in-class portion and get to fly.
Mhm.
So I was actually curious on how you started to get in-flight experience, because I have just a tiny little.
Yeah, that's more than I had. So I still don't own a drone myself. I just fly the things that I have through the office. And my first exposure to it was actually on that 40-hour resident course.
Okay.
And I was pretty intimidated by it. Everybody's a little worried about these things. And, it is not uncommon for students to flip drones when they're landing them or something. And, everybody freaks out. I flipped them. And I've been surprised at how rugged they are. But yeah, I think it's just, just getting out there. That was my first experience, was just flying, 2 days before I was evaluated to be able to get the license to begin with. So, and that's really a testament to just the flight control systems that are out there, and how easy this is. Really, what we're seeing is that there's a difficulty because we open it up. Anybody can be a pilot. We have, it's most common to have wildlife biologists, but we have admin professionals, we have IT professionals, we have maintenance staff, GIS folks, some aviators, folks who work on fire, all kinds. And anyone can fly. And since we're all credentialed at the department level, anybody can fly for anybody else. So I can go fly at Grand Canyon. Somebody from Parks or BLM could come fly for us. And we're all trained on that standard, which is great because it really, Park Service does not have a ton of pilots. I think they're less than 10. We have just over 60, but BLM has a few hundred, USGS has a ton. And so we really are able to kind of leverage everybody else and leverage their technology. But what's really been a boon for us is seeing, you know, just like GIS has become more available for folks over time, you know, through ArcGIS Online or that sort of stuff, the image processing that's available now for folks, that was always the missing gap. You know, you could be a wildlife biologist, but you had no idea how to put together an orthomosaic. And nowadays you can just throw it up in the cloud and have that thing processed for you while you're in bed, you know, and then the next day you have such a great suite of products.
Yeah, I need to check out that open drone map because we don't really have, we have, I think, one Metashape license at the Centroid.
Yep. Yeah, Open Drone Max, it's very, very good. They do it in a Docker container, if you're familiar with that at all, which makes it really easy. But then, you know, Esri provides, what is it, Drone to Map or something along those lines. So there's other options out there.
Is it a Pix4D?
Pix4D is another one, yeah, that's out there. Yep. Yep. Some of those we're not allowed to use. So we've got Open Drone Map on some of our servers, because we're, again, worried about that data security aspect of it. Where some of these data live are a huge concern for us. So
I bet. Excellent. Thanks for your time. That was a great
Hi,
presentation.
it's Pete. I just wanted to
Pete.
comment. Thank you for two things. Yeah, go out and go buy yourself a drone. There's a lot of cheap ones out there, but you know, for $100, you could probably get something that, you know, you can at least start learning how to fly and how to keep your eyes on things that are floating in the atmosphere and annoy your neighbors. I'm just kidding. But the second thing, and this is really, I think the key point was the image processing. And we can collect data all day long, but that image processing is so critical, and it's a huge data set. We're talking big data here potentially. So I'm glad you brought that up, Alan, because that's the back end. You know,
yeah,
everybody's like, yeah, we'll go fly and capture all this data. Who's going to deal with it? And do you know how to deal with it? So the fantastic. So
yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
I liked it. Good to hear from you, Pete.
Of course, always. Every now and again. Be well, everybody. Hug everybody who's important to you, including Pause, and listen to great music. And we'll all see each other one of these days. So take care.
Thanks, Pete. Mike had a question. Alan,
Yeah.
I think you've got.
Let's see. So what kind of hurdles do you overcome with other agencies? Yeah, so the Park Service, like I said, you know, they only have a handful of pilots. They're very, very restrictive. They were one of the first to put in a very restrictive policy around UAS use. And I think a big part of it was, you know, we're twice the size of the refuge system is twice the size of the park system. We don't have near the staff that they do, but we also don't have near the visitation that they do. And so really, I think they created a restrictive policy, and this is just me speculating, right? But they created a restrictive policy to meet the speculation or misinterpretation from the public, and them seeing that and saying, oh, well, I can go fly a drone on at my national park. And I mean, we've seen tons of news stories about that going wrong. You know, from drones ending up in you know, thermals, you know, in geysers at Yellowstone or whatever. And so just dealing with the different cultures within the agencies are some of the issues that we have to work around. BLM is a much more, and the Forest Service are much more top-down structure, hierarchical, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is a pretty horizontal management structure. And so making sure that we're not stepping on anyone's toes and those sorts of things are really important, and that we're getting the right approvals. You know, I mentioned the refuge system has its own regulations around what we can do. on refuges, but so does BLM and the Forest Service and the Park Service, and they're all a little bit different. The Forest Service is one of the best places. When I go out and do my proficiency flights, I go out to the Pawnee mostly because it's so easy. They're so permissive. As long as you're not shooting for commercial purposes, you can go out and fly typically. And so, you know, always check the local regulations, but they have a very permissive flight environment.
Awesome, thanks. And thanks, Mike, for all your questions. You had some
Yeah,
good
that's
ones.
a good one.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, why don't we wrap it up and go enjoy this beautiful day?
Yeah.
And I'm going to go check on the ruckus that my children and my dog are making. I don't know what's happening out there. But yeah, thanks so much for joining. And some of you four in the middle, I will see you next week for Josh's talk, and we'll talk more about field data collection.
All right. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
thank
everyone. I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.